I still remember the exact moment I realized my husband was planning to leave me. It wasn't the late nights at the office or the sudden business trips. It was a notification on my phone, a simple banking alert showing a transfer of $10,000 from our joint savings to an account I didn't recognize. Nathan had never made a financial move without discussing it with me first. At least, that's what I had believed for 12 years of marriage. Just a precaution, he'd explained when I casually mentioned it over dinner that evening. With the market so volatile, I wanted to diversify a bit. His explanation made perfect sense, except for the slight tightening around his eyes, a tell I'd learned to recognize during our years together. Nathan was lying. As a senior financial analyst at Jackson & Pierce Investment Management, I'd built my career helping clients protect their assets through economic uncertainties. I'd learned to spot patterns, anticipate market shifts, and prepare for worst-case scenarios. Skills, it turned out, that would serve me well beyond my professional life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Rebecca Collins, though most people call me Becky. At 42, I'd spent over a decade balancing my career in investment management with supporting Nathan's rise through the corporate marketing world. We'd met at a charity fundraiser when he was still struggling to establish himself, his student loans outweighing his modest salary at what was then a small marketing firm. I'd been drawn to his ambition, his charisma, and the way his face lit up when he talked about his dreams. Our partnership had seemed perfect, my financial acumen and industry connections complementing his creative vision and networking skills. When TechVision Marketing recruited him 3 years ago, it was my client referrals that helped him exceed his targets in those crucial first months. The executive position that followed, with its substantial salary increase and stock options, came after I introduced him to the company's CEO at a financial conference I'd been invited to speak at. Nathan never explicitly acknowledged how my connections had facilitated his success. I hadn't needed him to. We were a team, each contributing in our own way to build the life we shared in our Queen Anne townhouse with its view of the Seattle skyline. Or so I thought. The $10,000 transfer was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I noticed smaller withdrawals from our joint accounts, $2,000 here, $3,500 there. Never enough to trigger my automatic alerts, but substantial when viewed collectively. Meanwhile, Nathan's behavior shifted in subtle ways. He password protected his phone. Our conversations about future plans became vague. He started mentioning a new marketing specialist, Olivia, with increasing frequency. Olivia thinks we should restructure the social media strategy, he'd say. Or, Olivia found this amazing new restaurant downtown. The admiration in his voice was unmistakable. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I did what I'd been trained to do: gather information, analyze patterns, and prepare contingencies. Has Nathan mentioned anything about financial concerns lately? I asked Daniel Washington, my mentor at Jackson & Pierce, during our weekly lunch. Daniel had known us both since before we were married, having attended our wedding and numerous dinner parties over the years. Not specifically, Daniel replied, studying me with the careful attention that made him one of the firm's most valued advisors. Why do you ask? Just curious about some recent account activity, I said, keeping my tone casual. Several transfers to accounts I'm not familiar with. Daniel set down his fork, his expression shifting from professional interest to personal concern. Becky, is everything okay between you two? I met his gaze directly. I'm not entirely sure, but I'm taking precautions. He nodded, understanding the implication. Daniel knew me well enough to recognize when I'd identified potential risk and was implementing mitigation strategies. If you need any assistance with structuring options, I'm available, he offered, his careful choice of words acknowledging the sensitivity of the situation. I may take you up on that, I replied, grateful for his support. That afternoon, I called my friend Sophia Kim, who specialized in international banking. Our friendship dated back to college, long before I met Nathan, and she was one of the few people in my life who knew me independently of my marriage. Hypothetically, I began when we met for coffee the next day, what would be the most secure way to establish financial holdings that wouldn't be immediately traceable to the primary? Account holder? Sophia raised an eyebrow. Hypothetically, I'd suggest a series of structured investments through Singapore, possibly routed through a shell company with legitimate business purposes. And the documentation requirements? Considerable, but not insurmountable with the right guidance, she replied, sliding a business card across the table. The name on it wasn't hers, but belonged to a financial advisor specializing in international asset protection. This person can help with your hypothetical situation, she added. Just be clear about your intentions. They don't work with clients trying to evade taxes or hide illegal funds. This is completely legitimate, I assured her. Just private. Over the next 2 months, I methodically prepared for what I increasingly believed was inevitable. I established a separate email account for financial communications. I documented every unusual withdrawal Nathan made. I consulted with the Singapore advisor Sophia had recommended, creating a legal but private investment structure that would protect a portion of my personal assets. I didn't transfer our joint savings or touch Nathan's earnings. Instead, I redirected my personal investment bonuses, funds that had always gone into our shared future, into the new structure. I also moved the management of my inheritance, which had been sitting in a moderate yield account, into more strategic investments under my protected entity. All of this was done legally, transparently from a tax perspective, but privately from Nathan's view. He had never shown interest in the details of our investments, content to let me handle financial matters while he focused on his career. His disinterest had once seemed like trust. Now it offered protection. I've been thinking about our vacation. Property in the San Juans, Nathan mentioned one evening in late October, 6 months after I'd noticed the first unusual transfer. We should consider selling it next spring. The market's getting stronger. The vacation property had been purchased primarily with my inheritance, a gift from my grandparents intended to secure my future. Nathan knew how much that small waterfront cabin meant to me. It was the one place I truly relaxed, away from the constant demands of our Seattle lives. Any particular reason? I asked, keeping my voice neutral as I continued preparing dinner. Just thinking we could use the capital for other investments, he replied vaguely. Maybe look at properties in a different area, somewhere new. I nodded non-committally, but the suggestion confirmed my suspicions. Nathan was mentally divesting from our shared assets, preparing for a separation on his terms. The property was in both our names, my one financial oversight, made when I still believed our partnership was unbreakable. That night, after Nathan had fallen asleep, I sent a pre-drafted email to Grace Martinez, a divorce attorney whose reputation for discretion and effectiveness was well known in Seattle's financial circles. Daniel had recommended her months earlier, just as a resource, he'd said, recognizing my need for options before I'd explicitly acknowledged it myself. The consultation with Grace confirmed what I had already concluded. Washington state's community property laws meant that all assets acquired during our marriage would typically be divided equally, regardless of whose name they were in. However, assets I owned before marriage, or inherited specifically in my name, had some protections if they hadn't been completely commingled with marital property. The offshore investments you established with your personal bonuses, Grace explained in her downtown office with its view of Elliott Bay, would be considered marital property technically, but only if your husband becomes aware of them during discovery. And if he doesn't? I asked. Then they effectively don't exist in the context of the divorce negotiations, she replied, her expression professional but understanding. I'm not advising you to hide assets. That would be unethical and potentially illegal. I'm simply explaining. That disclosure relies on specific questioning or your voluntary declaration. I nodded, understanding the distinction. And the vacation property? More complicated, she admitted. Since it's in both your names, despite being purchased primarily with your inheritance, we'd need to establish the source of funds clearly and argue against commingling. As I left her office, I felt a strange mix of sadness and resolve. I wasn't planning to hide anything that was rightfully Nathan's. I simply wanted to protect what was mine, what I had built through my own efforts, separate from our partnership. The partnership that Nathan was already dismantling without my knowledge. The confrontation came 3 weeks before Christmas. I arrived home early from a client meeting to find Nathan sitting at our dining table, documents spread before him, an expression of practiced concern on his face. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Becky," he said, using the diminutive that had once been affectionate but now sounded condescending. "We need to talk." I set down my briefcase, recognized the scene for what it was, a carefully staged intervention, and took a seat across from him. "I'm listening." "I've been doing a lot of thinking about us," he began, his voice carrying the smooth cadence he used for important client presentations. "About where we are and where we're headed." I nodded, allowing him to continue, the speech he had clearly rehearsed. "I think we've grown apart," he continued, eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder rather than meeting my gaze directly. "We want different things. We've become roommates more than partners." "And what is it you want, Nathan?" I asked, my voice steadier than I had expected. He sighed, a practiced sound of regret. "I want a chance to rediscover what makes me happy, to explore possibilities I've postponed." "Does this exploration have a name?" I asked directly. His eyes widened slightly, genuine surprise breaking through his composed facade. "This isn't about anyone else," he insisted. "This is about us." "Is it?" His hesitation told me everything. "I have formed a connection with someone," he finally admitted. "But that's not why I'm suggesting we separate. It's just made me realize what's missing between us." "Olivia," I said, not bothering to frame it as a question. His slight flinch confirmed it. "It's not what you think. She understands my creative vision in a way you never have. We connect intellectually." I suppressed the urge to laugh at the cliché. "And have you and Olivia discussed your future plans? Financially, I mean." "We have," he acknowledged, straightening slightly in his chair. "I'm planning to start fresh, simplify my life." I nodded, taking a sip of water to compose myself. 12 years of shared history, dismissed for a marketing specialist he'd known less than a year. The pain was real, despite my preparations. "And what are you proposing for our situation?" I asked, curious to hear how he had planned this part. "I've spoken with an attorney," he said, switching to business mode. "I think we can handle this amicably. Equal division of our assets. Sell the house and split the proceeds. I'd like to keep my TechVision stock options since they're connected to my employment." "I see," I replied neutrally. "And the vacation property?" "We'd sell that too," he said. "Unless you want to buy out my half." "With what funds?" I asked innocently. He looked momentarily uncomfortable. "I know I've made some withdrawals recently. I needed to secure separate housing and prepare for this transition, but there's still the investment portfolio you manage. We can liquidate portions as needed." "The joint investment portfolio," I clarified. "Yes," he confirmed. "We'll need to divide all marital assets. My attorney says Washington law is quite clear on community property." I took another sip of water, considering my response carefully. "Nathan, I won't contest the divorce if that's what you want. But I think you should consult with your attorney again about exactly what constitutes marital property in our situation. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. What do you mean? Just that certain assets may not be as jointly owned as you believe, I explained. The vacation property, for instance, was purchased primarily with my inheritance. But it's in both our names, he countered, confidence returning. And we've both contributed to its maintenance and improvements. We'll let the attorneys sort through those details, I replied. Is there anything else you wanted to discuss tonight? He seemed taken aback by my composure, perhaps having expected tears or pleas or anger. I'll be staying at a corporate apartment for now, he said, gathering his documents. I'll arrange to collect my things this weekend. I'll make sure I'm not here, I replied, not wanting to witness him packing up our shared life. He paused at the dining room doorway. I never wanted to hurt you, Becky. I looked at the man I had spent 12 years with and realized I barely recognized him anymore. Or perhaps I was seeing him clearly for the first time. Intentions aside, I said quietly, the outcome remains the same. After he left, I sat in the silence of our dining room, processing what had just happened. The pain and betrayal were real. I wouldn't deny those emotions, but underneath them was something unexpected. Relief. The uncertainty was over. The waiting, the gathering evidence, the strategic preparation, all of it now had clear purpose. I picked up my phone and sent 2 text messages. The first to Grace Martinez. He's made his move, proceeding as discussed. The second to Daniel, Washington. Time to activate the contingency plan. Meeting tomorrow? Then I opened my laptop and accessed the secure portal for my Singapore investments. The structure was elegant in its simplicity, a series of legitimate investments managed through a properly registered entity. Everything declared for tax purposes, everything legally established, just not visible to Nathan or immediately traceable to our marital assets. I hadn't built this structure out of greed or malice. I'd created it because I understood something fundamental about financial security that Nathan never had. True protection required foresight and independent action. Nathan wanted his freedom with Olivia. He could have it, but he would soon discover that the lifestyle he'd grown accustomed to, the lifestyle supported by my financial acumen and industry connections, was not as easily replicated as he believed. I closed the laptop and poured myself a glass of wine. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations, painful realizations, and the first steps toward dismantling a 12-year marriage. But tonight, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of his betrayal, knowing it would fuel my resolve through what was to come. Because while Nathan was settling into his corporate apartment with visions of starting fresh with his young marketing specialist, I was preparing to reveal just how thoroughly he had miscalculated the woman he thought he knew. The morning after Nathan's announcement, I arrived at my office earlier than usual. Sleep had been elusive despite the single glass of wine and emotional exhaustion. I'd spent most of the night reviewing documents, refreshing my understanding of our assets, and preparing for my meeting with Daniel. The Seattle skyline was still dark outside my window, the twinkling lights of ferries crossing Elliott Bay providing the only movement in the pre-dawn stillness. I liked the office at this hour, the quiet allowing for clear thinking without interruptions. You look terrible, Daniel observed bluntly, setting a cup of strong coffee on my desk as he arrived. Despite the early hour, he was impeccably dressed, in his usual tailored suit, not a silver hair out of place. Thank you for that insightful observation, I replied, taking a grateful sip. He sat across from me, his expression softening. It happened, didn't it? I nodded, too tired for pretense. Last night. He's moving out this weekend. Daniel leaned back, absorbing this information. And you're certain about this? About letting him go? The question caught me off guard. Throughout my planning and preparation, I hadn't considered fighting for my marriage. Was that strange? Perhaps. But the trust was irreparably broken, and I'd never advised clients to invest in failing ventures. Why would I do so with my own life? He's already gone, Daniel, I said. Has been for months. I pulled up a secure folder on my computer. I need you to execute Phase 2 of our contingency plan, the transfer of management responsibilities for the TechVision pension fund. TechVision had become a client of Jackson & Pierce 3 years ago, right after Nathan joined the company. I'd brought them in through my connections with their CFO, and while I wasn't the official account manager, my insights had guided their investment strategy. Nathan had never made the connection, never realized how his company's financial stability was quietly supported by his wife's expertise. Daniel nodded, all business now. Transition to Williams's team? Yes, but gradually. I don't want it to appear connected to personal circumstances. Any particular timeline? I considered this. Start the paperwork today, but implementation over 30 days. Cite regulatory compliance reviews if anyone asks. They'll feel the impact within the quarter, Daniel noted, making notes on his tablet. That's the idea, I agreed. Nothing dramatic, just a slight shift in effectiveness that would be noticeable to the financial team. And the joint accounts? Daniel asked. I hesitated, considering my next move carefully. Leave those untouched for now. I don't want to alert him to anything unusual until after our initial legal discussions. Daniel nodded, understanding my strategy. You're meeting with Martinez again today? Yes, I'll need you to cover the Peterson quarterly review. Already rescheduled for tomorrow morning, he replied. Told them you were deep in compliance. Documentation. This was why Daniel had been my mentor and ally for over a decade. He anticipated needs before I voiced them. There's something else, I said, pulling a sealed envelope from my bag. I need you to deliver this to Melanie Winters. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Melanie Winters was the chief operating officer at TechVision and Nathan's direct supervisor. Is this what I think it is? He asked, taking the envelope carefully. It's information regarding certain marketing expenditures that don't align with company protocols, I explained. Nothing confidential, just public records that their compliance team seems to have overlooked. The structure was elegant in its simplicity, a series of legitimate investments managed through a properly registered entity. Everything declared for tax purposes, everything legally established, just not visible to Nathan or immediately traceable to our marital assets. I hadn't built this structure out of greed or malice. I'd created it because I understood something fundamental about financial security that Nathan never had. True protection required foresight and independent action. Nathan wanted his freedom with Olivia. He could have it, but he would soon discover that the lifestyle he'd grown accustomed to, the lifestyle supported by my financial acumen and industry connections, was not as easily replicated as he believed. I closed the laptop and poured myself a glass of wine. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations, painful realizations, and the first steps toward dismantling a 12-year marriage. But tonight, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of his betrayal, knowing it would fuel my resolve through what was to come. Because while Nathan was settling into his corporate apartment with visions of starting fresh with his young marketing specialist, I was preparing to reveal just how thoroughly he had miscalculated the woman he thought he knew. The morning after Nathan's announcement, I arrived at my office earlier than usual. Sleep had been elusive despite the single glass of wine and emotional exhaustion. I'd spent most of the night reviewing documents, refreshing my understanding of our assets, and preparing for my meeting with Daniel. The Seattle skyline was still dark outside my window, the twinkling lights of ferries crossing Elliott Bay providing the only movement in the pre-dawn stillness. I liked the office at this hour, the quiet allowing for clear thinking without interruptions. You look terrible, Daniel observed bluntly, setting a cup of strong coffee on my desk as he arrived. Despite the early hour, he was impeccably dressed. in his usual tailored suit, not a silver hair out of place. "Thank you for that insightful observation," I replied, taking a grateful sip. He sat across from me, his expression softening. "It happened, didn't it?" I nodded, too tired for pretense. "Last night. He's moving out this weekend." Daniel leaned back, absorbing this information. "And you're certain about this? About letting him go?" The question caught me off guard. Throughout my planning and preparation, I hadn't considered fighting for my marriage. Was that strange? Perhaps. But the trust was irreparably broken, and I'd never advised clients to invest in failing ventures. Why would I do so with my own life? "He's already gone, Daniel," I said. "Has been for months." I pulled up a secure folder on my computer. "I need you to execute Phase 2 of our contingency plan, the transfer of management responsibilities for the TechVision pension fund." TechVision had become a client of Jackson & Pierce 3 years ago, right after Nathan joined the company. I'd brought them in through my connections with their CFO, and while I wasn't the official account manager, my insights had guided their investment strategy. Nathan had never made the connection, never realized how his company's financial stability was quietly supported by his wife's expertise. Daniel nodded, all business now. "Transition to Williams's team?" "Yes, but gradually. I don't want it to appear connected to personal circumstances." "Any particular timeline?" I considered this. "Start the paperwork today, but implementation over 30 days. Site regulatory compliance reviews if anyone asks." "They'll feel the impact within the quarter," Daniel noted, making notes on his tablet. "That's the idea," I agreed. "Nothing dramatic, just a slight shift in effectiveness that would be noticeable to the financial team." "And the joint accounts?" Daniel asked. I hesitated, considering my next move carefully. "Leave those untouched for now. I don't want to alert him to anything unusual until after our initial legal discussions." Daniel nodded, understanding my strategy. "You're meeting with Martinez again today?" "Yes. I'll need you to cover the Peterson quarterly review." "Already rescheduled for tomorrow morning," he replied. "Told them you were deep in compliance. Documentation." This was why Daniel had been my mentor and ally for over a decade. He anticipated needs before I voiced them. "There's something else," I said, pulling a sealed envelope from my bag. "I need you to deliver this to Melanie Winters." Daniel raised an eyebrow. Melanie Winters was the chief operating officer at TechVision and Nathan's direct supervisor. "Is this what I think it is?" he asked, taking the envelope carefully. "It's information regarding certain marketing expenditures that don't align with company protocols," I explained. "Nothing confidential, just public records that their compliance team seems to have overlooked. Records that might raise questions about Nathan's department oversight," Daniel clarified. "Records that might prompt a closer look at expense approvals involving junior staff," I corrected, "particularly those involving Olivia Parker." Daniel's eyes widened slightly. "Expense irregularities with the woman he's involved with?" 3 business trips in the past 4 months listed as marketing strategy sessions that coincided with weekends, I said. "Hotel upgrades from standard rooms to luxury suites. Meal expenses for 2 at restaurants known more for their romantic ambiance than their business appropriateness." "How did you access this information?" Daniel asked cautiously. "I didn't need to access anything unauthorized," I explained. "Nathan used our joint credit card for the upgrades and additional expenses. Apparently, he forgot I received the detailed statements." Daniel nodded slowly, tucking the envelope into his jacket pocket. This could potentially damage his standing with the company. "Only if there's actually something inappropriate happening," I replied. "If these were legitimate business expenses, he has nothing to worry about." "Becky," Daniel said carefully, "are you sure you want to play it this way? You could walk away with half of everything without any of this maneuvering." I met his concerned gaze. This isn't about revenge, Daniel. It's about consequences. He nodded, understanding. Just be careful. These kinds of moves can escalate quickly. I'm not doing anything illegal or unethical, I assured him. I'm simply ensuring that Nathan understands exactly what he's walking away from and who he's walking away from before I let him go. Grace Martinez's office embodied a different kind of power than the glossy financial firms I usually frequented. The decor was deliberately understated, with comfortable but not ostentatious furniture and walls adorned with abstract art rather than obvious status symbols. The woman herself matched this aesthetic. Early 50s, with a sleek gray bob and simple, well-tailored clothing that communicated competence rather than flash. So he finally made his move, she said, after I'd recounted the previous night's conversation. Another middle-aged man throwing away a solid marriage for a younger model. How refreshingly original. Despite everything, I found myself smiling. I suppose we're all clichés in some way. Speak for yourself, she replied dryly. Now, you mentioned he's already consulted with an attorney? Yes, though he didn't specify who. Grace made a note. Based on what you've told me, he's operating under several misconceptions about your financial situation. He seems to believe all your assets are marital property, equally divisible. That was my impression as well. Let's clarify exactly what we're working with, she said, opening a folder containing the financial documentation I'd provided during our previous meetings. Your inheritance that purchased the vacation property, we have clear documentation showing it came solely to you, correct? Yes, my grandparents' estate distributed it directly to me 3 years before we purchased the property. And while the property is in both names, we can demonstrate that the down payment and majority of the mortgage payments came from segregated funds. Correct. I maintained separate documentation of all property expenses, showing which came from my inherited funds versus our joint accounts. Grace nodded approvingly. That's helpful. Now, regarding your Singapore investment structure, it's fully compliant with IRS reporting requirements? Absolutely, I confirmed. All proper tax filings have been made. The structure is private, but not hidden from legitimate government oversight. And these investments were funded entirely from your personal bonuses at Jackson & Pierce? Bonuses that were contractually separate from your base salary? Yes. My employment agreement specifies that performance bonuses are paid directly to me based on my individual client portfolio performance. They never entered our joint accounts. Grace reviewed her notes. And Nathan never inquired about these bonuses or their disposition? No. He was always more interested in discussing his own compensation packages. Financial details bored him unless they involved his immediate spending power. His loss, Grace remarked. Based on what you've provided, we have a strong position. The Singapore investments should remain entirely yours as separate property. The vacation property will be more contested, but we can make a compelling case for at least 70% ownership based on the source of funds. And the townhouse? I asked. More complicated, she admitted. While you made the larger down payment, it's been your joint residence for 9 years with mortgage payments from communal. Uns will likely need to sell and divide proceeds, or you could buy out his portion. I nodded, processing this information. What should I expect next? Once he formally files, which I anticipate will be within days given his apparent preparation, we'll respond with our initial position statement. I suggest we take a firm, but not inflammatory stance. Assert your rights to separate property while demonstrating willingness to fairly divide genuinely joint assets. That seems reasonable, I agreed. In the meantime, Grace continued, document everything. If he removes items from the house during his move this weekend, photograph what's taken. If he contacts you directly about financial matters, save the communications but direct him to me. As I left her office, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was still pain. The dissolution of a 12-year marriage couldn't happen without grief, regardless of the circumstances. But beneath that pain was a growing sense of clarity. The path forward was becoming visible, illuminated by the very skills I'd honed throughout my career: analysis, strategy, and careful execution. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. Package delivered to Melanie Winters. She was very interested in the contents. Also, Nathan called your office twice today. Didn't leave a message. I texted back, "Thank you. Proceed with TechVision account transition." Driving home, I realized I needed to find somewhere else to stay for the weekend. The thought of returning to an empty townhouse, one that had once contained our shared life, felt suddenly overwhelming. For the first time since Nathan's announcement, I felt tears threatening. Not for the loss of him, precisely, but for the loss of what I had believed our marriage to be. I pulled into a coffee shop parking lot and allowed myself 10 minutes. 10 minutes precisely, timed on my phone, to feel the full weight of what was happening. 12 years of partnership ending not with a mutual decision or gradual growing. Apart, but with a betrayal so commonplace it was almost insulting. When the timer chimed, I dried my eyes, reapplied my lipstick, and continued driving. Not home, but to the Four Seasons downtown. If Nathan was going to spend the weekend dismantling our life together, I would spend it being pampered in a luxury suite with room service and a spa appointment. A small indulgence, but one that felt like reclaiming something essential, my right to prioritize my own well-being. The hotel room offered a spectacular view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. As evening settled over the city, fairy lights traced paths across the darkening water, reminding me of possibilities, of movement from one shore to another. I ordered room service, opened a bottle of wine that cost more than was reasonable, and allowed myself to simply exist in the moment. My phone buzzed with an email notification from Grace. Nathan's attorney filed divorce papers this afternoon. As expected, they're requesting equal division of all assets, including your inheritance purchased. Property. I've prepared our response. We'll file Monday morning. So it had begun officially. I wasn't surprised by the speed. Nathan had clearly been planning this for months, just as I had. His attorney's position was also predictable, starting with the maximum possible claim. I forwarded the email to Daniel with a single word: initiated. He would understand what that meant. The TechVision account transition would proceed, not dramatically, but with the steady purpose we had planned. Not revenge, but consequence. The next morning brought another notification, this one from my banking app. Nathan had withdrawn $25,000 from our joint investment account, the maximum allowed without dual authorization. I wasn't concerned about the money itself. We had agreed to our response strategy for this scenario. What struck me was the predictability of it all. Nathan, who prided himself on creative thinking in his marketing career, was following the most conventional playbook possible in his personal maneuvering. I messaged Grace about the withdrawal, then spent the morning at the hotel spa, allowing skilled hands to work the tension from my shoulders. The physical release brought unexpected emotional clarity. I hadn't been happy either, I realized. Not truly, not for some time. I had accepted a partnership that consistently undervalued my contributions, professionally, financially, and personally. Perhaps this ending, painful as it was, offered freedom that would have taken years to claim otherwise. By Sunday evening, when I returned to our townhouse, Nathan had cleared out his possessions. The space felt different, emptier in obvious ways with gaps on bookshelves and bare spots on walls where his art had hung, but also oddly unburdened. I walked through each room, noting what he had taken: his clothes, his collection of marketing, awards, the expensive entertainment system he'd insisted we needed. What surprised me was how little his absence affected the overall feel of the home. Nathan had lived here for 9 years, yet his departure felt like a minor adjustment rather than a gaping void. Perhaps that was the most telling revelation about our marriage, how little of himself he had truly invested in our shared space. I was hanging my coat when the doorbell rang. Opening it revealed Sophia Kim, holding a bottle of expensive champagne and wearing an expression of determined cheer. "I heard," she said simply. "News travels fast," I replied, stepping aside to let her in. "Divorce is like a pandemic in our circle," she said, following me to the kitchen. "Everyone watches anxiously, wondering if they'll be next." I smiled despite myself. Sophia had never married, preferring what she called relationships with clear exit strategies. Her directness had always been refreshing. "I assume you've been nominated as the reconnaissance team?" I asked, retrieving 2 champagne flutes. She laughed. "Guilty, though I volunteered for the role. Better me than Jennifer with her inevitable, everything happens for a reason platitudes." As we settled in the living room with our champagne, Sophia studied me carefully. "You seem remarkably composed for someone whose husband just left them for his 20-something colleague. What would you prefer, that I wail and rend my garments?" "It would be the expected response," she admitted. "This calm calculation is unsettling." I sipped my champagne, considering how much to reveal. Sophia wasn't just a social friend. She had helped facilitate my Singapore connections. She understood financial strategies and personal protection. "I'm processing the situation in my own way," I said carefully. "By filing a detailed counterclaim within 3 days and somehow triggering an internal expense audit at TechVision that has Nathan's entire department scrambling?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. I stared at her, genuinely surprised. "How do you know about the expense audit?" She smiled slightly. "My new client is TechVision's CFO. Apparently, there's quite the internal investigation happening regarding certain marketing strategy sessions that seems suspiciously recreational in nature." This was an unexpected development. I had anticipated questions about Nathan's expense reports, but not a full departmental audit. "The expense issue has nothing to do with me," I replied truthfully. "The envelope I'd sent Melanie Winters had contained only documentation of expenses charged to my personal credit card. How TechVision chose to respond was entirely their internal decision." "Perhaps," Sophia conceded, "but it's remarkably convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" I met her gaze directly. "What exactly did you come here to ask, Sophia?" She set down her glass. "None of us realized how prepared you were, Becky. The Singapore structure, the inheritance documentation, the expense records, it's impressive. I'm not here to judge. I helped with part of it. I just want to understand what your end game is." I considered my response carefully. Sophia wasn't my enemy, but complete transparency wasn't necessary either. "My end game is simple," I said finally. "I want what's legitimately mine, what I earned, what I inherited, what I built. Nathan is free to keep what's legitimately his. I'm not interested in punishing him, just in ensuring he understands the reality of our situation. And that reality is that his professional success, financial stability, and social standing were never solely his own achievement," I explained. "They were facilitated by connections, opportunities, and support that he's now choosing to walk away from." Sophia nodded slowly. "He still doesn't know about the Singapore investments?" "He never asked where my bonuses went," I replied. "Year after year, he celebrated my professional achievements without once questioning how those achievements translated financially. His oversight, his loss," she said, raising her glass slightly. "Indeed. And TechVision's pension fund management? I heard rumors that Jackson and Pierce might be transitioning that account." I kept my expression neutral. "Client relationships evolve based on service needs and regulatory requirements. Any transitions would be routine business matters." A small smile played at Sophia's lips. "Of course, purely coincidental timing." We finished our champagne in comfortable silence. Sophia understood the world I operated in, the careful balance of influence and discretion that characterized high-level financial management. She wouldn't press further. As she prepared to leave, she paused at the door. For what it's worth, Nathan's an idiot, not just for the obvious midlife crisis cliché, but for underestimating you all these years. Perhaps we both underestimated me, I replied. After she left, I walked through the townhouse again, this time with purpose rather than reflection. Despite Nathan's departure, this space still felt like mine in ways our marriage hadn't for some time. I had chosen the location for its investment potential years before we'd purchased it. I had selected most of the furnishings, planned the renovations, created the environment that had sheltered our partnership. Now it would shelter me alone as I navigated the dissolution of that partnership, not as a victim of abandonment, but as a strategist reclaiming independence. My phone buzzed with an email from Daniel. TechVision transition papers filed with compliance. Also, interesting development. Nathan's department under full audit. Apparently, expense documentation raised significant concerns. CFO requesting, meeting with you next week to discuss continued investment management. I smiled slightly at the perfect symmetry of it. Nathan had initiated proceedings to sever our personal relationship, unaware of how that decision would ripple through his professional life. Not through any direct action on my part, but through the natural consequences of connections suddenly becoming visible after years of invisible support. I responded to Daniel. Schedule the CFO meeting for Wednesday. Prepare the full portfolio. Review we discussed. Tomorrow morning, Grace would file our formal response to Nathan's divorce petition. The legal process would unfold with its own procedural rhythm. But the true revelation was just beginning. The gradual understanding that would dawn on Nathan as he discovered exactly what he had walked away from, and exactly who he had underestimated when he decided our marriage was disposable. I opened my laptop and began preparing for the week ahead. There was work to be done, strategies to refine, a future to secure. The path would not be without pain, but it would be entirely mine to determine. For the first time in 12 years, that thought brought not anxiety but a surprising sense of freedom. The Four Seasons presidential suite offered a panoramic view of Puget Sound, with ferries gliding across the water like tiny illuminated ships in a child's bathtub. From this height, people looked like miniature figures moving along predetermined paths. I wondered if Nathan felt the same way watching them, not realizing he too was moving along a path I had quietly anticipated. My phone chimed with a text from Grace. Filing complete. Nathan has been served. I didn't respond immediately, instead sipping my coffee and watching the city wake up. 3 days at the Four Seasons had given me clarity and distance. Exactly what I needed before returning to the townhouse and beginning the next phase of this process. When I finally replied to Grace, it was just 2 words: proceeding accordingly. She would understand. We had planned this meticulously. The next phase would begin with subtle changes to the financial landscape Nathan had taken for granted. Nothing dramatic, just enough to create questions he couldn't easily answer. My phone rang. Nathan. Rebecca, he began without preamble. When I answered, using my full name rather than the familiar Becky he'd used throughout our marriage. This is absurd. According to these papers, you're claiming the vacation property, sole ownership of your investment accounts, and half of our joint assets. What exactly am I supposed to get after 12 years of marriage? Exactly what the law stipulates, I replied calmly. Your separate property remains yours, as mine remains mine. Joint assets are divided equitably. That vacation property was purchased during our marriage, he countered, frustration evident in his voice. It's clearly marital property. It was purchased with my inheritance, Nathan. Funds that were specifically left to me before our marriage and kept separate from our marital assets. I've made substantial improvements to that property over the years, he argued. Weekend projects, maintenance, the dock rebuilding last summer. Weekend projects using materials purchased from our joint account, which I've acknowledged in the filing. The dock was rebuilt by contractors I hired and paid from my separate funds. There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from indignation to calculation. I want what's fair, Rebecca. We both contributed to building our life together. Yes, we did. And now we're both experiencing the consequences of your decision to end that life together. I kept my voice neutral, factual. The law is clear on separate versus marital property. Your attorney can explain the details. Speaking of attorneys, he said, his voice hardening. Mine thinks there's a strong case for including your investment bonuses as marital property, regardless of where you deposited them. By all means, make that case, I replied. Just be prepared for extensive discovery into exactly how those bonuses were earned and what agreements governed their distribution. I could practically hear him weighing his options. Nathan had always been pragmatic when it came to risk assessment. What do you really want? He finally asked. I want exactly what I'm entitled to under the law, I replied. Nothing more, nothing less. This isn't like you, he said, a note of confusion entering his voice. You've always been reasonable, willing to negotiate. People change, Nathan, something you've recently demonstrated quite thoroughly. After another strained silence, he sighed. Fine. I'll review everything with my attorney and get back to you through proper channels. As I hung up, I received another text, this one from Daniel. Meeting with TechVision CFO confirmed for Wednesday. Also, interesting development. Expense audit has expanded to include departmental budget allocations. Olivia Parker placed on administrative leave pending investigation. My eyebrows rose slightly. That was unexpected. I had anticipated questions about the expense reports, but placing Olivia on leave suggested the company had found more significant issues. I made a mental note to prepare additional documentation for the CFO meeting. Whatever was happening at TechVision would inevitably affect Nathan's financial position during our negotiations. My phone rang again almost immediately. Nathan again. What did you do? He demanded without preamble. You'll need to be more specific, I replied, keeping my tone even. Olivia has been placed on administrative leave. TechVision is conducting a full audit of our marketing department. The executive team is questioning expense reports I approved. This has your fingerprints all over it. That sounds like a TechVision internal matter, I observed, not a divorce issue. You know damn well what you did, he snapped. You sent someone information about our business trips. Your business trips, I corrected. Trips charged to my credit card. If TechVision has questions about those expenses, perhaps you should discuss it with your finance department. This isn't a game, Rebecca, he said, voice rising. This could seriously damage my position at the company. Actions have consequences, Nathan, I replied evenly. Just as your decision to end our marriage has consequences. I suggest you focus on your response to the divorce filing. Everything else is peripheral. After hanging up, I gazed out at the sound again. Nathan still didn't understand what was happening, that every foundation he believed was solid had actually been built on invisible supports I had strategically placed over the years. Supports I was now quietly removing one by one. 2 days later, I returned to our townhouse to find it largely unchanged, except for the conspicuous gaps where Nathan's belongings had been. His books missing from the shelves, his marketing awards gone from the office, his clothes no longer hanging in the master closet. What surprised me was how little it affected the overall feel of the space. Nathan had lived here for 9 years, yet his absence felt like a minor adjustment rather than a gaping void. I was unpacking my suitcase when the doorbell rang. Opening it revealed Melanie Winters, TechVision's COO, holding a bottle of wine and wearing an expression of professional neutrality. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. "I was in the neighborhood and thought we might talk." Melanie and I weren't friends exactly. We had met at various corporate functions over the years, maintaining the cordial relationship of professional women who respect each other's capabilities without developing personal ties. Her appearance at my door was unexpected, but not entirely surprising. "Not at all," I replied, stepping aside to let her in, "though I'm curious about the nature of this visit." "Let's call it a professional courtesy," she said, following me to the kitchen where I retrieved 2 wine glasses. "We have a meeting scheduled with Jackson and Pierce tomorrow, but I thought a preliminary conversation might be beneficial." I poured the wine she'd brought, an excellent Cabernet I noted, and led her to the living room. "A conversation about what exactly?" Melanie took a measured sip before answering. "About the interesting coincidence of Nathan's department coming under financial scrutiny just as your marriage is ending." I met her gaze directly. "If you're suggesting I orchestrated an audit of TechVision's marketing department, you're overestimating my influence." "Am I?" she asked, her tone neutral, but her eyes sharp. "Our finance team received documentation showing questionable expense allocations, documentation that traced back to your personal credit card statements." "Nathan used our joint credit card for certain expenses," I explained truthfully. "When I noticed unusual charges, I naturally kept records. Where those records ended up is not something I controlled." She studied me for a moment. "The audit has uncovered significantly more than just Nathan's expense reports. There appears to be a pattern of budget misallocation involving several recent hires, including Olivia Parker." This was new information. "That sounds like an internal TechVision matter." "It is," she agreed, "but it's also potentially relevant to your current situation. Nathan's position at the company is now precarious. His financial standing may be significantly different by the time your divorce negotiations conclude." I considered her words carefully. Melanie wasn't here by accident or for casual conversation. As COO, she had specific concerns about the company's operations and reputation. "Are you warning me or informing me?" I asked directly. A slight smile crossed her face. "Let's say I'm ensuring all parties have accurate information for decision-making. Tomorrow's meeting will include discussion of our pension fund management, a significant relationship with Jackson and Pierce that was initially facilitated through your connection with our CFO. A connection that remains professional regardless of my personal circumstances," I noted. "Of course," she agreed smoothly. "Just as our concerns about departmental financial management remain professional regardless of personal relationships within the company." The subtext was clear. TechVision was separating Nathan's issues from their relationship with Jackson and Pierce, providing me an opportunity to do the same. "I appreciate the professional courtesy," I said, raising my glass slightly. She nodded, understanding passing between us. 2 professional women acknowledging the complexity of a situation without needing to state things explicitly. "How long have you known?" I asked, curiosity getting the better of me. "About Nathan and Olivia? Since the first strategy retreat in Vancouver," she replied. "About the financial irregularities? Only since the documentation arrived last week." "And your position on all this?" "Professionally, I can't tolerate financial mismanagement or conflicts of interest within the company," she said without hesitation. "Personally." She paused, considering her words. "I find it disappointing when people with genuine talent compromise themselves for such predictable indiscretions." I nodded, appreciating her candor. "We share that perspective." As Melanie left an hour later, I felt a strange sense of respect for how she had handled the situation. She had come not to threaten or accuse, but to establish clear boundaries around the professional relationships that would continue regardless of the personal drama unfolding. My phone buzzed with a text from Grace, Nathan's attorney, requesting meeting to discuss recent developments affecting financial disclosure, suggesting Thursday. I replied, "Thursday works. Let's see what these developments entail." Whatever Nathan had learned about his situation at TechVision had clearly prompted a shift in his approach to our divorce negotiations. I wasn't surprised. Nathan had always adjusted his strategy when facing unexpected obstacles. It was one of his professional strengths. What he hadn't yet realized was that his current obstacles weren't random or unfortunate circumstances, but the natural consequences of decisions he had made without fully understanding their implications. The meeting with TechVision's CFO the next day proceeded exactly as Daniel and I had anticipated. The company wanted to maintain its relationship with Jackson and Pierce while ensuring proper oversight of their pension management. I assured them that my personal situation would have no impact on their account service, while suggesting a review of their investment strategy might be timely given current market conditions. "We could transition your account to another team if that would make you more comfortable," I offered, knowing they would decline. "That won't be necessary," the CFO replied predictably. "Your team's performance has been exceptional. We simply wanted to ensure continuity during what might be distracting circumstances. My personal and professional lives remain entirely separate," I assured him, though I appreciate the consideration. What remained unspoken was the more significant issue: TechVision's internal audit and its potential impact on Nathan's department. The CFO made no mention of it during our official meeting, but as we concluded, he paused before leaving. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "the board values financial transparency above all else. The current internal review is necessary regardless of any personal connections involved." I nodded, understanding his message. TechVision would proceed with its audit based on evidence, not personal vendettas. Nathan would be treated according to what was discovered, not based on his marital status. Thursday's meeting with Nathan and our respective attorneys was held in Grace's office, neutral territory that somehow still felt like home field advantage. I arrived 15 minutes early to review strategy with Grace. "Nathan's attorney submitted a revised proposal last night," she said, sliding a document across the table. "They've conceded on several key points. Nathan gets his personal effects and half the joint accounts as we expected. He's no longer contesting your inheritance as the source of funds for the vacation property, but he's requesting a 30% equity position based on improvements and maintenance." I scanned the document, noting the significant shift from his initial position. "What changed?" "Hard to say for certain," Grace replied, "but I suspect his financial situation has become less secure than he anticipated. The request for a lump sum settlement rather than ongoing property interest suggests he needs capital rather than long-term assets." This aligned with what I had heard about the TechVision audit. Nathan was facing professional uncertainty and adjusting his divorce strategy accordingly. "The 30% equity claim is still excessive," I noted. "The improvements he made were minimal and mostly funded from joint accounts we're already dividing." "Agreed," Grace said. "I suggest we counter with 15% and settle around 20%. It's a relatively small concession that might facilitate agreement on the larger issues." I nodded, seeing the strategy. "And the artwork he's requesting?" Grace consulted her notes. 4 specific pieces, all gifts he gave you over the years: the Chihuly glass sculpture, the photography print from your trip to New Zealand, and 2 paintings from local artists. I considered this request. These weren't our most valuable pieces, but they held sentimental significance. The Chihuly, in particular, had been a gift for our 10th anniversary. He can have them, I decided. Unlike the financial matters, these were genuinely personal items that held meaning for Nathan. Allowing him to keep them was a small gesture that cost me nothing significant. "Are you sure?" Grace asked. "The Chihuly alone is appraised at—" "I'm sure," I interrupted. "Some things aren't about monetary value." Grace studied me for a moment. You're not what I expected when you first walked into my office, Rebecca. Most clients in your position would be fighting for every penny and possession. This was never about punishing Nathan, I reminded her. It's about ensuring equitable distribution based on actual contribution and legitimate ownership. Before she could respond, her assistant announced that Nathan and his attorney had arrived. The next hour proceeded with the clinical efficiency of dissolving a business partnership, which in many ways was exactly what our marriage had become. Assets divided, paperwork signed, futures officially separated. Nathan was subdued throughout, none of his usual confident charm evident in his demeanor. When his attorney stepped out to make a call, he finally spoke directly to me. "I hear you met with TechVision's executives," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I meet regularly with Jackson and Pierce clients," I replied. "TechVision is an important account for the firm. An account that may be reconsidering its relationship with certain employees," he said pointedly. I met his gaze. "Client relationships evolve based on performance and trust, Nathan. Something I've always understood in my professional practice." "Don't," he said sharply. "At least give me the dignity of acknowledging what you've done." I considered him for a moment. "And what exactly have I done, Nathan?" "You've systematically undermined my position at TechVision while simultaneously cutting off my financial resources." His voice was low, controlled. "The audit has expanded to include all marketing initiatives from the past year. Olivia has been terminated. I've been placed on administrative leave pending a full review." "That sounds like a challenging situation," I acknowledged neutrally. "It's professional sabotage," he countered, "and we both know it." I leaned forward slightly. "What we both know, Nathan, is that actions have consequences. You chose to end our marriage for a younger woman. That was your right. But you don't get to dictate how I reorganize my professional relationships afterward." "This goes beyond professional reorganization," he argued. "You deliberately exposed expenses you knew would trigger an investigation." "If I wanted to destroy you," I said quietly, "you wouldn't be sitting here negotiating favorable artwork selections. You'd be facing a contested divorce, a termination for cause, and potential legal action from TechVision for financial impropriety. What you're experiencing now is simply the removal of the invisible support system you never acknowledged." His brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Before I could respond, his attorney returned, and the moment passed. We completed the settlement signing with professional courtesy. As Nathan stood to leave, I noticed the subtle signs of strain, the slight loosening of his collar, the absence of his usual confident posture, the shadows under his eyes suggesting sleepless nights. "Nathan," I called as he reached the door. "You forgot your copy of the artwork appraisals. You'll need it for the removal service." He turned back, his expression unreadable as he took the folder. "Thank you." After he left, Grace turned to me. "You mentioned an invisible support system. Care to elaborate?" "Nathan has always believed his success was entirely self-made," I explained. "He never understood that I was quietly creating opportunities and removing obstacles throughout our marriage. Not just financial support, but professional connections, strategic introductions, even the coincidental meetings with influential people who later became his clients or mentors." "And now you've stopped," she observed. "Not stopped," I corrected. "Just become visible as the source. The difference is significant." Daniel was waiting in my office when I returned to Jackson and Pierce that afternoon. "Congratulations on finalizing the settlement," he said, rising to greet me. "How does it feel to be officially single again?" "Ask me in a few months," I replied, setting down my briefcase. "What's the status on the TechVision situation?" "Their board met this morning," he reported, checking his tablet. "They've officially terminated Olivia Parker for violations of company financial policies. Nathan remains on administrative leave, but sources suggest they're building a case for serious demotion rather than termination." I nodded, processing this information. A demotion was significant. It would mean reduced compensation, diminished authority, and a substantial blow to the professional image Nathan had carefully cultivated. Yet it wasn't complete career destruction. That felt proportionate. And their pension fund management? I asked. Secure for now, Daniel confirmed. The CFO specifically mentioned that your handling of this situation demonstrated the professionalism they value in their financial partners. A small victory, but a meaningful one. I had maintained the clear separation between personal and professional matters that was essential in financial services. There's something else, Daniel added, his expression turning more serious. TechVision's audit uncovered evidence that Olivia had been accessing confidential client information without authorization, information she apparently shared with competing agencies before major pitches. This was unexpected. Industrial espionage? Not quite that dramatic, Daniel clarified. More like inappropriate information sharing to give herself leverage when interviewing with competitors. Nathan appears to have been unaware, but as her direct supervisor, he's being held accountable for the oversight failure. I absorbed this new information. Olivia had been playing a more complicated game than either Nathan or I had realized. She wasn't just an ambitious young woman attracted to a successful older man. She was strategically using that connection to advance her own career through dubious means. Nathan must be devastated, I said, surprised to find I genuinely meant it. For all his flaws, Nathan took professional ethics seriously within his own understanding of them. Learning that Olivia had compromised his department's integrity would cut deeply. Reportedly, he was the one who discovered and reported the information breach once the audit began, Daniel said. Too late to save his position, but possibly enough to avoid termination. This, too, was consistent with the Nathan I had known. When facing a crisis, he would salvage what he could while accepting necessary losses. It was the same approach he had taken in our divorce negotiations, conceding on the vacation property while securing the artwork that held personal meaning. Do we need to make any adjustments to our strategy? Daniel asked. I considered the question carefully. The original plan had been to gradually reestablish normal investment processes for TechVision after Nathan's position had been appropriately recalibrated. The new information didn't fundamentally change that approach. Proceed as planned, I decided. The quarterly portfolio review is scheduled for next month. We'll use that opportunity to demonstrate our continued commitment to their financial success, regardless of personnel changes in their marketing department. As Daniel left to implement these directives, I turned to the window overlooking the IDT Seattle skyline. In one of those gleaming buildings, Nathan was likely facing the most significant professional crisis of his career. In another, TechVision executives were recalibrating their marketing strategy in the wake of departmental upheaval. And here I stood, finally visible as the architect of my own destiny rather than the silent supporter of someone else's ambitions. The revelation had begun, but it wasn't complete. Nathan still didn't fully understand the extent of my influence over his professional success, or how dependent his future rebuilding would be on the foundation of contacts and strategies I had helped establish. That understanding would come gradually as he navigated his new reality, a reality shaped not by malice or vengeance on my part, but by the natural consequences of choices made without full awareness of their implications. For now, I had a firm to run, clients to advise, and investments to manage, including the ones that would determine whether my own future thrived in the aftermath of this necessary dissolution. The path ahead was clear, illuminated by the very skills that had always defined my professional success: analysis, strategy, and steady execution. The week passed with the structured precision that had always characterized my professional life. Quarterly reviews completed, client portfolios adjusted, investment strategies refined. To anyone observing from the outside, it would appear that my divorce had caused barely a ripple in the smooth operation of my career and finances. Appearances, as I well knew, could be deceiving. Each night, I returned to the townhouse that still held echoes of a 12-year marriage, a marriage I had believed was built on mutual respect and shared ambition, only to discover it had morphed into something else when I wasn't looking. Or perhaps I had been looking but chose not to see the signs until they became impossible to ignore. The Singapore transfer completed last night, Daniel reported during our morning briefing on Friday. All documentation finalized, compliance, verification complete. I nodded, sipping my coffee. The Singapore investment structure, the cornerstone of my financial independence, was now completely secured and legally insulated from any potential future claims. The structure had been established legally from the beginning, but this final administrative phase removed any remaining theoretical vulnerability. And Nathan's position at TechVision? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Daniel checked his tablet. Official announcement went out yesterday afternoon. He's been demoted from marketing director to senior marketing consultant, a significant step down in both authority and compensation. No direct reports, limited budget approval, required oversight on all client interactions. I absorbed this information without visible reaction. The consequence seemed proportionate to Nathan's professional lapses, not career-ending, but a substantial recalibration that would force him to rebuild his reputation through demonstrated value rather than charm and connections. Have you confirmed the final settlement logistics for next week? I asked, shifting the subject. Yes, the artwork removal service is scheduled for Wednesday morning. The financial transfers will process Thursday once the final paperwork clears. Everything is on track for a clean conclusion. I made a note in my calendar and tried to ignore the faint melancholy that accompanied this procedural update. Practical matters were easier to focus on than the emotional reality of permanently severing a 12-year partnership, regardless of the circumstances that had led to this point. There's something else you should know, Daniel added, his tone shifting slightly. I had lunch with James Chen from TechVision's finance team yesterday. Apparently, Nathan has been making inquiries about early access to his company retirement account. This caught my attention. That's unusual. Those funds would be subject to substantial penalties for early withdrawal. Exactly, Daniel confirmed. It suggests he's facing more significant financial pressure than we anticipated. Chen mentioned that the demotion came with approximately a 40% compensation reduction, combined with the expense of setting up a new residence and legal fees from the divorce. He's cash flow negative, I concluded. It wasn't difficult to calculate. Nathan had always lived slightly beyond his means, confident that the next promotion or bonus would cover any shortfalls. Without those prospects, his financial situation would deteriorate quickly. Daniel nodded. I thought you should be aware, especially since the settlement payment is still processing. I considered this new information carefully. My intent had never been to destroy Nathan financially, only to ensure he understood the reality of his situation. If he was considering desperate financial measures like early retirement withdrawals, his circumstances might be more precarious than I had calculated. Monitor the situation, I decided. If his financial position becomes truly untenable, we'll reassess. After Daniel left, I found myself staring out the window at the rain sheeting down over the Seattle skyline. The gray sky matched my mood, not regretful exactly, but contemplative. What was the appropriate level of concern for someone who had betrayed your trust but shared 12 years of your life? At what point did accountability become cruelty? My professional expertise had always been finding the optimal balance in financial matters, maximum return with appropriate risk mitigation. But the calculus of emotional closure was proving more complex than any investment algorithm I'd ever developed. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. Drinks tonight? You need a break from both work and wallowing. I smiled slightly at her directness. Sophia had never been one for gentle suggestions. Not wallowing, I replied. Strategic contemplation. Her response came immediately. Same difference. Canless Bar, 7 p.m. Don't make me drag you there. Perhaps she was right. I had been immersed in work and divorce logistics for weeks, moving between the office and the empty townhouse with minimal human interaction beyond professional necessities. An evening of normal social conversation might provide needed perspective. Canless offered one of Seattle's most spectacular dining views, perched above Lake Union with the city skyline spread below. The elegant bar area hummed with quiet conversation as I arrived, spotting Sophia at a window table nursing what appeared to be a martini. "You're looking entirely too serious for someone who just successfully navigated both a divorce and a corporate power play," she observed as I joined her. "Is that what I did?" I asked, signaling the bartender for the same drink she was having. "With impressive precision," Sophia confirmed, though I'm still waiting to hear the full story of how TechVision's marketing department imploded so spectacularly, coincident with your marital dissolution. "Pure coincidence," I replied mildly. "Corporate governance issues often surface during periods of leadership transition." She laughed, clearly not believing me but respecting my discretion. "Well, whatever didn't happen by your hand has certainly worked in your favor. I hear Nathan's new position comes with significantly diminished prestige and compensation." "Where do you hear these things?" I asked, genuinely curious about her information sources. "I make it my business to know what happens in Seattle's corporate ecosystem," she replied with a slight smile. "Just as you make it your business to understand capital flows. Speaking of which, how's your Singapore structure performing?" "Exactly as designed," I said, accepting the martini the bartender delivered. "Secure, compliant, and completely separate from domestic complications." "And your plans now that the divorce is finalized?" I paused, considering the question. Throughout the divorce process, I had been so focused on resolving the immediate issues that I hadn't given much thought to what came after. What did freedom from a 12-year partnership actually mean for my daily life, beyond the obvious legal and financial implications? "I haven't decided," I admitted. "For now, I'm focusing on maintaining stability for my clients and the firm." Sophia studied me over the rim of her glass. "That's your professional plan. I'm asking about Rebecca the person, not Rebecca the financial analyst." "I'm not sure those are separate entities," I replied, only half joking. "And that," she said pointedly, "is precisely the problem. You've spent 12 years subordinating personal fulfillment to professional excellence and marital accommodation. The divorce papers are signed. The financial structures are secure. What do you actually want for yourself?" Her directness was both uncomfortable and refreshing. During my marriage to Nathan, I had gradually aligned my personal preferences with what worked for our partnership. Vacations that accommodated his conference schedules, social engagements that benefited his networking needs, even home decor choices that reflected his preferred aesthetic. When had I last made a significant life decision based solely on my own desires? "I'm not sure," I said honestly. "I think I need some time to rediscover what that even looks like." Sophia nodded, her expression softening slightly. "That's a normal response. Just don't use work as an excuse to avoid the exploration. Financial analysis is your expertise, not your identity." As our conversation shifted to other topics, mutual friends, Seattle politics, Sophia's latest dating disaster, I found myself relaxing for the first time in weeks. The tension I'd been carrying through the divorce proceedings began to dissipate, replaced by something that felt almost like anticipation. There was a blank canvas where my marriage had been, intimidating, perhaps, but also full of potential. When I arrived home later that evening, I found an envelope that had been slipped under my door. Inside was a handwritten note from Nathan, the first direct communication we'd had since signing the final settlement paperwork. "Rebecca, I've been doing a lot of thinking about everything that's happened. I realize now how much I took for granted during our marriage, not just financially, but professionally and personally. The connections and opportunities I attributed to my own efforts were often facilitated by you in ways I never acknowledged or perhaps even recognized. The past few weeks have been a harsh education in reality. I won't pretend this note is entirely selfless. My financial situation is more precarious than I anticipated, and TechVision's decision to demote rather than terminate me seems more punishment than opportunity. I'm not asking for reconciliation. Too much has happened, and we're both moving forward with separate lives. But I would appreciate the chance to talk, not about the divorce or settlement, just an honest conversation about where things went wrong and what I failed to see. If you're willing, perhaps coffee sometime next week. Nathan. I read the note twice, trying to gauge its sincerity. Was this genuine reflection or strategic repositioning? The Nathan I had known for 12 years was capable of both: authentic introspection in private moments and calculated charm when necessary to achieve specific outcomes. His acknowledgement of my invisible support was particularly interesting. Had the revelation truly registered, or was this language crafted to appeal to what he believed I wanted to hear? And what was the purpose of the requested meeting? The mention of his precarious financial situation suggested an ulterior motive beyond mere closure. I set the note aside, deciding not to respond immediately. Whatever Nathan's intentions, this communication represented a significant shift from his previous position. The man who had confidently announced his departure for a new life with Olivia was now alone, professionally diminished, and financially constrained, reaching back to the partnership he had so casually discarded. My phone buzzed with an email from Grace, forwarding communication from Nathan's attorney. Client has expressed concern about cash flow issues affecting his ability to establish appropriate housing, requesting acceleration of settlement payment if possible. So there it was, the context for the handwritten note. Nathan's personal outreach was at least partially motivated by financial necessity. Time to soften me before the formal request came through legal channels. The synchronization was almost impressive in its calculation. I replied to Grace, "No objection to accelerating the payment. Process as soon as documentation allows." The financial aspect was immaterial to me at this point. The settlement amount had been agreed upon and would transfer regardless of timing. Accelerating it cost me nothing and might provide Nathan needed stability as he adjusted to his new circumstances. That seemed appropriate regardless of his motivations for asking. As for the request to meet, that required more consideration. What would be gained from such a conversation? The legal matters were settled. The professional consequences had manifested. Was there value in a personal post-mortem of a failed marriage, or would it simply reopen wounds that had begun to heal? I didn't reply to Nathan's note that night. Instead, I found myself walking through the townhouse, seeing it with new eyes. The spaces that had felt emptied by Nathan's departure now appeared open with possibility. The wall where his marketing awards had hung could display the photography I'd always enjoyed, but he had found too abstract. The office he had dominated could be reimagined as the reading room I'd wanted when we first purchased the property. For the first time, I began to envision the space as truly mine, not simply as a setting emptied of its second occupant. The realization was surprisingly liberating. This wasn't just the absence of Nathan, it was the presence of unconstrained choice. The next morning, I woke early and composed a brief response to Nathan's note. "Nathan, I've authorized acceleration of the settlement payment to address your financial concerns. As for meeting to discuss the past, I don't see the value in revisiting decisions that have been made and consequences that are already unfolding. We've both learned what we needed to from this experience, albeit through different paths. I wish you well as you rebuild. For both our sakes, I think it's best we maintain the separation we've established and move forward independently. Rebecca." I slipped the note under his apartment door on my way to the office, preferring this method of communication to the more immediate but less definitive alternatives of email or text. A handwritten response to a handwritten inquiry felt appropriately final. the last personal exchange marking the conclusion of our personal relationship. At the office, Daniel was waiting with updates on the TechVision account and several other client matters. We moved through the business of the day with efficient focus, but I found my mind occasionally drifting to the question Sophia had posed. What did I actually want now that I was free to choose based solely on my own preferences? You seem distracted, Daniel observed as we concluded our morning meeting. Everything okay with the settlement? The settlement is proceeding smoothly, I assured him. I'm just contemplating next steps. Professional next steps or personal? He asked perceptively. Both, I suppose. They've been intertwined for so long it's difficult to separate them. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. You know, when my wife and I separated 8 years ago, I threw myself into work as a distraction. Effective in the short term, destructive in the longer term. You need something beyond Jackson and Pierce to rebuild around. I hadn't thought much about Daniel's divorce, which had happened before I joined the firm. He rarely mentioned his personal life, maintaining the same professional boundary I had always valued. His decision to reference it now suggested genuine concern. What did you do? I asked, genuinely curious. I bought a sailboat, he said with a small smile. Had no idea how to sail, but I'd always wanted to learn. Spent weekends on the Sound making every mistake possible until I figured it out. It was completely separate from my established identity, something just for me that had nothing to do with the life I'd left behind. The concept resonated unexpectedly. What had I always wanted to explore but set aside for practical reasons or partnership accommodation? What interests had remained dormant while I focused on building our shared life? I've always wanted to learn photography, I found myself saying. Not just casual snapshots, but real composition and technical skill. Nathan thought it was too time-consuming for someone with my professional responsibilities. And now Nathan's opinion is irrelevant, Daniel pointed out. Seems like perfect timing to me. The idea took root immediately. Photography required focused attention on the present moment, something I had rarely allowed myself during the strategic planning of recent months. It would take me out of the office and the townhouse into settings where neither financial analysis nor divorce proceedings were relevant. I think I'll look into classes, I said, making a note on my tablet. Good, Daniel replied with evident approval. The Singapore investments will still be there after you've taken some time for yourself. As he left my office, I found myself opening a browser and searching for photography courses in Seattle. The Pacific Northwest offered spectacular natural subjects, mountains, coastlines, forests, along with the urban landscape I navigated daily but rarely truly saw. Perhaps viewing my environment through a different lens, literally and figuratively, would help reframe my perspective on this transitional period. I registered for a weekend workshop starting the following month, then sent a brief email to Sophia. You were right. Taking steps to separate personal fulfillment from professional identity. Signed up for photography workshop. Thanks for the nudge. Her response arrived almost immediately. About damn time. I expect properly composed blackmail. Photos of me by summer. For the first time in weeks, I laughed out loud, a genuine expression of amusement that echoed slightly in my office. The sound was unfamiliar but welcome, like rediscovering a forgotten melody. The remainder of the day passed in routine professional matters, client calls, investment reviews, committee meetings. But underneath the familiar rhythm ran a current of anticipation I hadn't experienced in years. The freedom to reimagine my life without consultation or compromise was both daunting and exhilarating. When I returned to the townhouse that evening, I was surprised to find another envelope, this one containing a formal letter from Nathan rather than a personal note. Rebecca, I received your note and understand your position regarding a meeting. While disappointed, I respect your decision to maintain separation as we move forward. I want to express my gratitude for your willingness to accelerate the settlement payment. This gesture of good faith means more than you might realize as I work to stabilize my situation. When we met at Grace's office to sign the final papers, you mentioned something about an invisible support system that I had failed to recognize throughout our marriage. At the time, I didn't fully grasp your meaning, but recent events have provided painful clarity. My demotion at TechVision came with the revelation that many of my most significant client relationships had been initially facilitated through connections to Jackson and Pierce. The foundation of professional success I believed was entirely self-created was actually built on networks you helped establish and maintain. Similarly, the social standing I enjoyed in Seattle's business community was substantially enhanced by your reputation and relationships. As these connections have cooled in recent weeks, I've been forced to acknowledge how much I relied on your credibility to establish my own. This isn't an attempt to change your mind about our separation or to solicit further assistance. It's simply an acknowledgement of truth that's long overdue. You were not just my wife, but a significant architect of the professional and social framework I operated within, a contribution I failed to recognize or appreciate until it was withdrawn. I wish you well in your continued success, which I now understand was never dependent on our partnership in the way mine apparently was. Sincerely, Nathan. I set the letter down, experiencing a complex mixture of emotions. There was vindication, certainly. Nathan finally acknowledging what I had known for years about the dynamics of our relationship. But there was also a tinge of sadness that this recognition had come only after separation forced it into the open. Would our marriage have evolved differently if Nathan had recognized these realities while we were still together? Would acknowledgement of my contributions have changed how he valued our partnership? Or was the fundamental issue not his failure to recognize my support, but his willingness to discard it for what he perceived as a more exciting alternative? These questions had no definitive answers, nor did they particularly matter at this point. We had both made choices that led to this outcome. Nathan choosing to pursue a relationship with Olivia, me choosing to protect my interests when I recognized the warning signs. The only relevant question now was how I would use the independence that had resulted from those choices. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. Settlement payment processing tomorrow. Artwork removal Wednesday. The procedural notification brought me back to the present moment. The legal and financial dissolution of our marriage was nearly complete. The past couldn't be rewritten. Only the future remained open to new possibilities. I didn't reply to Nathan's letter. There was nothing further to discuss, no additional perspective to share. His acknowledgement of the realities I had always recognized didn't change the fundamental breach of trust that had ended our marriage. Understanding might bring him closure, but it didn't create a basis for continued connection. Instead, I opened my laptop and began researching photography equipment. If I was going to explore this long-deferred interest, I would do so properly, investing in quality tools and dedicated time rather than treating it as a casual hobby. The familiar process of analytical research, comparing specifications, reading, reviews, evaluating options, felt comforting even as I applied it to this unfamiliar domain. By the time I closed my laptop several hours later, I had ordered a professional-grade camera system, registered for 3 different workshops spanning the next 6 months, and joined 2 local photography groups that organized weekend excursions to capture Seattle's diverse landscapes. These tangible steps toward a new interest felt surprisingly significant, not just activities to fill newly available time, but the beginning of an identity expanded beyond the parameters that had defined me during my marriage and career. Rebecca the financial analyst was now also becoming Rebecca the photographer, with other dimensions yet to be discovered. As I prepared for bed, I realized I had spent the entire evening focused on future possibilities rather than past disappointments. The revelation Nathan had finally experienced, understanding the true nature of the partnership he had discarded, was satisfying, but ultimately backward-looking. My attention was now directed toward the horizon, where new experiences and self-discoveries awaited. The transition wouldn't be instantaneous or without challenges. 12 years of marriage had created deeply ingrained patterns of thought and behavior that wouldn't disappear simply because the legal relationship had ended. But for the first time since discovering Nathan's betrayal, I felt genuinely optimistic about what lay ahead. Not just resigned to necessary changes, but actively curious about where they might lead. Tomorrow would bring the final financial transfers that formally concluded our economic partnership. The day after would see the removal of the artwork Nathan had requested, the last physical artifacts of our shared history to be separated. These procedural steps would close the chapter that had begun 12 years ago, when I believed our partnership was built on mutual respect and shared ambition. The next chapter remained unwritten, its potential bounded only by choices I was now free to make based solely on my own values, interests, and aspirations. For all the pain and disruption of recent months, this hard-won freedom was a gift I intended to use wisely. 1 year to the day after Nathan had announced his intention to leave our marriage, I stood on the deck of my newly purchased cabin in the San Juan Islands, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of amber and rose. The property wasn't our former vacation home, that had been sold months ago as part of the final settlement, but a smaller, more secluded spot on a different island. This place was entirely mine, chosen without compromise or consultation, a physical manifestation of my reclaimed independence. The 12 months since the divorce had unfolded with unexpected richness. What had initially felt like an ending had gradually revealed itself as a beginning, the first chapter of a life defined by my own choices rather than the parameters of partnership. My phone chimed with a text from Sophia. Happy Independence Day, 1 year divorce-free. Champagne still chilling for dinner? I smiled, typing back. Deck is ready. Sunset spectacular. Don't forget your camera. The light is perfect. Photography had indeed become more than just a post-divorce distraction. The weekend workshops had expanded into a serious creative pursuit, complete with a small but growing portfolio of work that had recently been featured in a local gallery's Emerging Artists Showcase. The technical precision that served me well in financial analysis translated surprisingly effectively to composition and exposure calculations, while the creative aspects provided a balance my analytical mind had been quietly craving. I set my phone aside and breathed in the salt-tinged air, allowing myself a moment of reflection on the year's journey. Professional life at Jackson & Pierce had continued with steady success, client portfolios thriving, my team expanding with promising new analysts. The Singapore investments had performed exceptionally well, providing a financial foundation that allowed for both security and new ventures without concern for budgetary constraints. But the most significant changes had been personal, not professional. I had gradually reclaimed spaces and experiences that had been unconsciously surrendered during my marriage. Simple pleasures like spending an entire Sunday immersed in a novel without feeling guilty about wasted time. Spontaneous decisions to explore unfamiliar neighborhoods without carefully considering another person's preferences. The freedom to leave dishes in the sink if I chose, or to rearrange furniture at midnight simply because the inspiration struck. These weren't dramatic transformations, but the cumulative effect of these small freedoms had reshaped my daily experience in profound ways. I was becoming more fully myself, not a new person, but perhaps a more authentic version of who I had always been beneath the accommodations and compromises of partnership. The sound of a boat approaching interrupted my contemplation. Sophia was arriving for our planned dinner, a simple celebration of what we had jokingly begun calling my rebirth day. The anniversary of Nathan's departure marked not just the end of a marriage, but the beginning of this unexpected renaissance. You look disgustingly content, Sophia called as she secured her boat to my dock, like some kind of self-actualized Mountain sage who's discovered all of life's secrets. Just enjoying the view, I replied, making my way down to help with the bag she was unloading. Though I do feel unusually philosophical today. Anniversary reflection is allowed, she conceded, handing me a cooler, as long as it's forward-looking rather than past-dwelling. Definitely forward, I assured her, though I did have an interesting email from Daniel this morning. Work emergency? She asked as we climbed the path to the cabin. Not exactly. Apparently, Nathan has accepted a position with a marketing firm in Portland. He's leaving Seattle. Sophia raised an eyebrow as she set down her bags in the kitchen. And how do you feel about that particular development? I considered the question while uncorking the wine I'd been chilling. Neutral, mostly. His career path isn't relevant to my life anymore, though I admit I'm curious about what prompted the move. Professional fresh start, presumably, Sophia suggested, accepting the glass I offered. His reputation in Seattle's marketing circles took quite the hit after the TechVision implosion. This was true. Nathan's demotion had been followed by a period of professional stagnation at TechVision. He had eventually left for a lateral position at a smaller firm, maintaining financial stability, but losing the upward trajectory that had once defined his career ambitions. Portland's a good market for creative professionals, I noted. Smaller than Seattle, but with a strong agency presence. It's a logical choice. And conveniently removes him from your sphere of occasional awkward encounters, Sophia added pragmatically. When was the last time you actually saw him? About 3 months ago at the Wilson fundraiser. We exchanged polite greetings, nothing more. The truth was that Nathan had become increasingly peripheral to my life as the months passed. After the initial period of legal and financial disentanglement, our paths rarely crossed except at occasional industry events, where we maintained professional courtesy without meaningful interaction. His move to Portland would simply formalize the separation that had already occurred in every significant way. Well, I propose a toast, Sophia said, raising her glass, to geographic as well as emotional closure, and to whatever comes next. We clinked glasses and moved to the deck, where I had prepared a simple dinner to enjoy as the sun completed its descent behind the islands scattered across the horizon. The conversation flowed easily between professional updates, social gossip, and plans for the coming months. Sophia had recently been promoted to lead her bank's Asia-Pacific division, which would require extensive travel. A development she viewed with characteristic enthusiasm for both the professional opportunity and the expanded dating pool, as she put it. What about you? She asked as we finished the meal. Any interesting developments on the romantic horizon? That gallery owner at your photography show seemed quite attentive. I smiled, remembering the opening night event where James Sullivan, the gallery's owner, had spent considerable time discussing my work and suggesting potential collaboration opportunities. We've had coffee twice to discuss a possible exhibition series, I acknowledged, but it's professional, not romantic. Are you sure he knows that? Sophia pressed with a knowing look, because his attention seemed rather more focused on the photographer than the photographs. Even if that's true, I'm not looking for a relationship right now, I replied. I'm enjoying my independence too much to complicate it with dating. Sophia studied me thoughtfully. There's a difference between not actively seeking something and being closed to its possibility when it presents itself. Just something to consider. Her gentle observation lingered as our evening continued with more wine and conversation against the backdrop of stars emerging in the clear island sky. Was I unconsciously closing myself off to new connections out of self-protection? The year of independence had been profoundly restorative, but at what point did healthy self-sufficiency become unnecessary isolation? After Sophia departed the next morning, promising to visit again before her Asia assignment began, I found myself considering her question more seriously. My post-divorce life had been deliberately structured around reclaiming individual identity and rebuilding confidence in my own judgment. Those goals had been largely achieved. I no longer defined myself primarily in relation to my failed marriage, or measured my choices against what Nathan might have expected. Yet I had maintained a certain emotional distance in my new relationships, keeping connections either professionally focused or casually social without deeper vulnerability. The photography community I'd joined provided creative camaraderie, but remained comfortably compartmentalized from my personal life. Even my growing friendship with James had been carefully managed to emphasize artistic collaboration rather than personal connection, despite what Sophia had perceived as mutual interest. I spent the remainder of my island weekend photographing the changing light across the water, hiking the property's wooded trails, and allowing these thoughts to surface without immediate judgment or resolution. By Sunday evening, as I prepared to return to Seattle for the work week ahead, I had reached a tentative conclusion. While I wasn't ready to actively pursue romantic involvement, I could perhaps be more open to recognizing and exploring potential connections when they naturally arose. Back in Seattle, Monday morning brought a familiar routine of client meetings and portfolio reviews. The financial markets had been volatile recently, requiring careful adjustments to maintain optimal growth while managing risk. Exactly the kind of analytical challenge I had always enjoyed. I was deep in spreadsheet analysis when my assistant announced an unexpected visitor. "Grace Martinez is here," she said. "She doesn't have an appointment but says it's important." I hadn't seen my divorce attorney since finalizing some minor property transfers 6 months earlier. Her appearance at my office was surprising but not concerning. Grace wasn't one for dramatic gestures without legitimate purpose. "Send her in," I replied, closing my laptop to give her my full attention. Grace entered with her usual purposeful stride, immaculately dressed in a charcoal suit that projected the quiet authority that had made her so effective during the divorce proceedings. "Rebecca," she greeted me with a brief handshake. "Thank you for seeing me without notice. I have information that might interest you, and I preferred to deliver it personally rather than over the phone." "Of course," I replied, gesturing for her to take a seat. "What's this about?" "Nathan Collins," she said directly. "Or more specifically, a case involving him that recently came across my desk through unusual circumstances." My curiosity was immediately piqued. "What kind of case?" "A potential civil suit against TechVision regarding intellectual property. Misappropriation," she explained. "The details are confidential, but the essentials involve marketing strategies Nathan developed while employed there that he may be attempting to implement with clients at his new position in Portland." I processed this information, uncertain why Grace felt it necessary to share it with me. "I'm not sure how this concerns me. Nathan and I have been divorced for a year, and I have no stake in either TechVision's legal matters or Nathan's current employment." "Ordinarily, I would agree," Grace acknowledged. "However, there's an unusual complication. The documentation supporting TechVision's potential claim includes references to strategy frameworks that appear to have originated from investment approaches developed at Jackson & Pierce, specifically models very similar to your client segmentation methodology." This was unexpected. During our marriage, Nathan and I had occasionally discussed our respective professional approaches in general terms, sharing broad concepts without specific proprietary details. I had explained my client segmentation strategy as an example of how analytical frameworks could identify optimal investment approaches for different risk profiles. Nathan had found the concept interesting, but hadn't seemed to grasp its technical nuances. "Are you suggesting Nathan adapted my investment methodology for marketing applications?" I asked, trying to understand the implications. "That appears to be the case," Grace confirmed. "The documentation shows a marketing segmentation approach that mirrors your investment model's structure, just applied to consumer behavior rather than risk tolerance. TechVision is claiming ownership since it was developed during his employment there, while Nathan seems to be arguing it's a general concept not specific to any proprietary framework." I considered this information carefully, Why bring this to me rather than to Jackson and Pierce's legal department? If there's a potential intellectual property issue involving the firm's methodologies, they should be notified directly. Grace smiled slightly. I did suggest that to TechVision's counsel. However, before escalating to firm-wide legal involvement, I thought you might appreciate the opportunity to review the situation personally. The models in question were primarily your development, and there are sensitive aspects to how this information might have been transferred. The implication was clear. If Nathan had adapted methodologies he'd learned about through our personal relationship rather than through proper professional channels, the situation carried implications. Beyond standard intellectual property disputes, it potentially revealed yet another way he had benefited from our marriage without acknowledgement or permission. I'd like to see the documentation, I said after a moment's consideration. Grace nodded, opening her briefcase and removing a sealed folder. This contains the relevant materials from TechVision's initial claim filing. They haven't formally proceeded yet, but they're building their case. I'd appreciate your perspective on whether the similarities are coincidental or constitute actual adaptation of your work. I accepted the folder, appreciating Grace's discretion in bringing this to me personally before it potentially became a more complex legal matter involving both firms. I'll review it today and get back to you. After she left, I opened the folder and began examining the documents. The similarities were immediately apparent to someone familiar with my original work. Nathan had indeed adapted my investment segmentation framework almost wholesale, simply changing the terminology and application context while maintaining the underlying analytical structure. What had been a model for evaluating investment risk tolerance across different client profiles had become a system for categorizing consumer purchasing behaviors and targeting marketing strategies accordingly. The irony wasn't lost on me. Even now, a year after our divorce, and with his career taking him to a different city, Nathan was still building his professional approach on foundations I had created. The intellectual appropriation was subtle enough that most would never recognize it, but unmistakable to someone familiar with the original methodology. I closed the folder, considering my options. TechVision had a legitimate claim regarding work product developed during Nathan's employment there, but the deeper issue of the methodology's origin was more complex. Jackson and Pierce would have its own intellectual property concerns if my investment frameworks had been adapted without authorization, even informally. Yet pursuing this matter would inevitably create additional professional complications for Nathan, just as he was attempting to rebuild his career in a new location. While he had certainly earned consequences for his personal betrayal, extending those consequences indefinitely through legal action felt disproportionate to the offense, especially since the adaptation, while unattributed, wasn't direct plagiarism, but conceptual application in a different field. After careful consideration, I reached a decision that felt aligned with both professional ethics and personal boundaries. I called Grace to discuss my perspective. The similarities are definitely not coincidental, I confirmed when we connected. Nathan clearly adapted my investment framework for marketing applications. However, I don't believe Jackson and Pierce needs to become directly involved at this stage. May I ask your reasoning? Grace inquired, her tone professional but curious. The core methodology, while developed for our firm's client approach, uses analytical principles that aren't themselves proprietary, I explained. The application to marketing is sufficiently transformed that it constitutes adaptation rather than direct appropriation. I wouldn't consider it intellectual property theft in the strict legal sense. There was a brief pause before Grace responded. That's a generous interpretation given the circumstances. It's an accurate interpretation, I corrected gently. And I'd prefer to maintain my focus on moving forward rather than creating new entanglements with the past. Grace seemed to accept this perspective. I'll convey your assessment to TechVision's counsel, though I should note that they may still proceed with their claim regarding work developed during his employment. That's their prerogative, I acknowledged. I just don't see value in escalating this into a multi-firm legal dispute when the core issue is between Nathan and his former employer. After concluding the call, I returned to my analytical work with renewed focus. The incident had provided an unexpected perspective on how completely I had moved beyond the emotional aftermath of my marriage's dissolution. A year ago, discovering Nathan's continued reliance on my intellectual contributions might have triggered frustration or resentment. Today, it generated little more than mild curiosity and a pragmatic assessment of the appropriate professional response. This emotional distance wasn't detachment or indifference. It was the healthy separation that comes from genuine closure. Nathan's actions, whether personal or professional, no longer had the power to disrupt my equilibrium or divert my attention from the life I was creating. That evening, as I reviewed the final changes to a client presentation scheduled for the following day, my phone buzzed with a text from James Sullivan, the gallery owner. New photography exhibition opening Thursday featuring Northwest landscapes. Thought it might interest you both as photographer and subject. Dinner after if you're available? I found myself smiling at the message, appreciating both its professional relevance and its casual personal invitation. 6 months ago, I might have responded with a professionally focused acceptance that carefully sidestepped the dinner suggestion. Today, considering Sophia's gentle observation about remaining open to possibilities, I typed a different reply. Exhibition sounds fascinating. Dinner after would be lovely. Looking forward to both. It was a small step, just dinner with someone whose company I enjoyed, without predetermined expectations or boundaries. But it represented a willingness to allow new connections to develop naturally, neither rushing toward replacement attachment nor reflexively protecting against potential vulnerability. As I set my phone aside and returned to my work, I realized that this might be the most significant indicator of my post-divorce evolution. The ability to approach new relationships, whether professional, creative, or personal, from a position of secure independence rather than reactive self-protection, suggested a deeper healing than I had previously recognized. Whatever developed with James, whether simply artistic collaboration, genuine friendship, or eventually something more, would be based on mutual interest and authentic connection, rather than unconscious patterns or unexamined needs. The same applied to all aspects of my reclaimed life. Each choice now made from agency rather than accommodation. Each relationship entered with conscious intention rather than habitual response. The contrast with my years with Nathan was striking. Throughout our marriage, I had gradually surrendered aspects of my identity and independence, often without realizing the cumulative effect of small compromises. The invisible support I provided, professionally, financially, socially, had come at the cost of my own visibility. The framework I had created for his success had simultaneously constructed constraints around my own potential. Nathan's betrayal, painful as it had been, had ultimately forced the dismantling of those constraints. The structures I had built to protect myself during the divorce had evolved from defensive necessity to empowering foundation. The Singapore investments that had initially represented financial security now funded creative pursuits and personal exploration. The professional reputation that had once facilitated Nathan's advancement now opened doors for my own expanding interests. As I completed my work and prepared for bed, I found myself surprisingly grateful for the journey of the past year, not for the betrayal that had initiated it, but for the growth it had ultimately enabled. The revelation that had shaken Nathan's understanding of his success had similarly transformed my understanding of myself. He had discovered that his achievements were not entirely self-made. I had discovered that my value was not defined by supporting someone else's ambitions. Tomorrow would bring client meetings, investment decisions, and the ongoing business of financial management. The following day would include photography in the early morning light before office hours, capturing the city awakening from a perspective few bothered to witness. Thursday would now feature an art exhibition and dinner with someone who appreciated both my analytical mind and creative eye. Each of these activities represented a facet of the multidimensional life I was crafting, not a reaction to what had been lost, but an authentic expression of who I was becoming. The anniversary that might once have been marked by reflection on betrayal and ending had instead become a celebration of discovery and beginning. 1 year after Nathan had revealed the true nature of his commitment to our marriage, I had revealed the true nature of my capacity for resilience and reinvention. Perhaps that was the most valuable discovery of all. Not what had been taken from me, but what had been within me all along, simply waiting for the freedom to emerge. 3 years had passed since Nathan emptied our accounts before filing for divorce, unaware of the offshore savings I had quietly established. What had begun as a strategic response to betrayal had evolved into something far more significant than financial protection. Standing at the window of my corner office at Jackson & Pierce, watching Seattle's skyline glimmer in the late afternoon light, I reflected on how thoroughly my life had transformed. The phone on my desk buzzed. "Ms. Collins? The board members are assembled in the conference room," my assistant announced. "Thank you, Emma. I'll be right there," I replied, gathering the presentation materials for what would be my first official meeting as Jackson & Pierce's newly appointed managing director. The promotion had been announced last week, making me the first woman to hold the position in the firm's 40-year history. Daniel, who had supported my advancement from the beginning, had been the first to congratulate me, followed by a flood of messages from colleagues and clients who had witnessed my steady rise through the leadership ranks. "You've earned this 10 times over," Daniel had said, embracing me warmly after the partners' vote. "Though I suspect even you couldn't have predicted this outcome when you first walked into my office worried about unusual account transfers." He was right. When I had first noticed Nathan's financial maneuvers 4 years ago, my focus had been purely defensive, protecting what was rightfully mine while preparing for an unwanted but necessary dissolution. I could never have anticipated how that moment of crisis would ultimately create space for unprecedented growth and opportunity. I smoothed my jacket, checked my reflection briefly in the glass, and made my way to the conference room where the firm's board awaited my strategic vision presentation. The confidence I felt wasn't the calculated poise I had once manufactured for professional settings, but a genuine certainty born of proven capability and clear purpose. "Good afternoon," I began, meeting the eyes of each board member as I took my position at the head of the table. "Today, I'll be outlining Jackson & Pierce's strategic direction for the next 5 years, with particular focus on our expansion into sustainable investment markets and our new Asia-Pacific initiative." The presentation flowed smoothly, each slide representing months of careful analysis and forward-thinking planning. This was my element, translating complex financial data into clear strategic pathways, but now enhanced by the creative perspective I had developed through photography and other artistic pursuits. "What distinguishes our approach from competitors," I explained, highlighting a particularly innovative portfolio structure on the screen, "is our integration of traditional investment principles with emerging value metrics that capture both financial and social returns." The board's engagement was evident in their thoughtful questions and focused attention. These were experienced financial leaders who had unanimously supported my appointment, recognizing that my vision for the firm represented exactly the balance of proven expertise and innovative thinking they needed to navigate evolving markets. As the meeting concluded with enthusiastic approval of my proposed direction, I felt a moment of quiet satisfaction. This success hadn't come at anyone else's expense or through compromise of my values. It was the natural progression of consistent excellence and authentic leadership, qualities that had always been within me but had flourished once freed from the constraints of supporting someone else's ambitions. "Excellent presentation, Rebecca," said Eleanor Winters, the board's senior member and a pioneering woman in Seattle's financial sector. "I particularly appreciate how you've integrated traditional growth metrics with next-generation value assessment. It's precisely the direction financial services must evolve toward. Thank you, Eleanor, I replied, genuinely appreciative of her endorsement. Eleanor had been something of a mentor since my promotion to the executive team, offering the perspective of someone who had navigated leadership positions when female executives were even rarer than they remain today. We should discuss the Singapore expansion in more detail, she suggested as we walked together toward the elevator. Perhaps dinner next week? I have some connections in the region that might be useful as you develop that market. I'd appreciate that, I agreed, making a mental note to have Emma schedule it. The Singapore connection felt particularly fitting. The very region where I had established the investment structures that protected my assets during the divorce was now becoming a focal point for the firm's international growth under my leadership. As Eleanor departed, Daniel approached with a knowing smile. The board is thoroughly impressed, though not surprised. You've been effectively leading strategic direction for months already. The title just finally caught up with reality. It helps to have preparatory time, I acknowledged. The transition plan you developed gave me exactly the runway needed to refine the vision. Daniel's decision to step back from day-to-day leadership while remaining as a senior advisor had created the opportunity for my advancement. His recognition of my capabilities and his willingness to champion them to the partners represented mentorship at its most effective. Any celebration plans? He asked as we returned to the executive floor. James is cooking dinner tonight, I replied with a smile. Something elaborate involving multiple courses and wine pairings, if his hints are anything to go by. Daniel nodded approvingly. He's good for you. Balances that analytical mind with appreciation for life's sensory pleasures. My relationship with James Sullivan had evolved gradually from collegial artistic connection to genuine partnership over the past 3 years. What had begun with exhibition discussions and post-opening dinners had deepened into a relationship characterized by mutual respect and complementary strengths. His artistic sensibility and my analytical perspective created a balance that enhanced both our personal connection and our respective professional pursuits. Unlike my marriage to Nathan, this relationship had developed without expectation or obligation. We maintained separate residences, James in his apartment above the gallery in Capitol Hill, me in my renovated townhouse in Queen Anne, while spending time together when it aligned with our individual rhythms and responsibilities. The arrangement provided both intimacy and independence, a combination I had discovered was essential to my well-being. As I returned to my office to complete the day's remaining tasks, my phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. Heard about the board presentation. Triumph as expected. Still flying in tomorrow for celebratory weekend? I confirmed our plans. Looking forward to seeing my friend despite her increasingly international schedule. Sophia's leadership of her bank's Asia-Pacific division had her based in Singapore much of the year, making her visits to Seattle occasions worth prioritizing. Our friendship had deepened despite the geographic distance, evolving from social connection to something approaching sisterhood. The remainder of the afternoon passed quickly in a series of client calls and team meetings. As the office gradually emptied and Seattle's early winter darkness settled over the city, I found myself alone on the executive floor, reviewing final details for tomorrow's leadership team briefing. A soft knock at my partially open door drew my attention. Grace Martinez stood in the doorway, elegant as always in a simple black suit that had become something of a personal trademark. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. "I was in the building for a mediation and thought I'd offer congratulations in person." "Grace," I greeted her warmly, gesturing for her to enter. "It's good to see you. Please come in." Our relationship had evolved from attorney-client to occasional professional collaboration as her practice increasingly focused on corporate governance alongside her divorce specialty. While we weren't close friends, we maintained a mutual respect and genuine goodwill that transcended our initial connection. "Managing director?" she said with a slight smile as she took a seat. "Quite the achievement, though not surprising to anyone who's worked with you. Thank you, I replied simply, accepting the recognition without deflection, another skill I'd developed in recent years. I occasionally think about our first meeting, Grace mused. You were so contained, so strategic even in crisis. Most clients in that situation are overwhelmed by emotion, but you were already mapping contingencies and identifying leverage points. Self-protection, I acknowledged. Though at the time, I couldn't have imagined where those strategies would ultimately lead. Grace nodded thoughtfully. The best outcomes often emerge from our most challenging circumstances, provided we respond with clarity rather than reaction. You exemplified that approach. There was a brief, comfortable silence before she continued. I actually have another reason for stopping by. I thought you might want to know that Nathan Collins has apparently relocated again, Portland to Chicago this time. I raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised that Grace would think this information relevant. That's a significant move, though I'm not sure why you thought I'd be particularly interested. She smiled slightly at my response. Professional habit, keeping clients informed of potentially relevant developments. Though I suppose after 3 years, his movements hardly qualify as relevant to your situation. Hardly, I agreed, though I found myself curious despite my detachment. Do you know what prompted the move? Only that it involves a senior position with a national agency headquartered there. Quite a step up from his Portland role, apparently. I nodded, processing this information with mild interest, but no emotional response. Nathan's career trajectory had ceased to be personally significant long ago, becoming simply another data point about someone I had once known intimately, but now regarded with the neutral distance of a former association. I'm glad he's found a positive direction, I said truthfully. The anger and hurt that had once accompanied thoughts of Nathan had dissolved years ago, replaced by a detached goodwill that wished him neither success nor failure. Simply a life that continued its separate path from mine. Grace seemed to approve of my response. That's the healthiest perspective. Though I must admit, there's professional satisfaction in seeing how differently your respective journeys have unfolded since the divorce. I smiled at her candor. We all create our own paths, Grace. Nathan is discovering his, just as I've developed mine. After Grace departed, I completed my preparations for the next day before gathering my things to leave. The office was quiet now, most of the staff having departed hours earlier. I enjoyed these solitary moments in the space that now, in some sense, represented the culmination of my professional journey. The evening air was crisp as I walked to my car, Seattle's winter chill carrying the faint scent of salt water from the Sound. Despite the familiar surroundings, I felt a momentary sense of wonder at the path my life had taken. The woman who had once discovered her husband's betrayal through unexpected account transfers was still recognizable in my reflection, but transformed in fundamental ways by the journey that discovery had initiated. James was waiting when I arrived. At his apartment, the promised dinner already in progress with tantalizing aromas filling the open concept space. His gallery occupied the building's ground floor, with his living quarters taking advantage of the high ceilings and industrial character of the converted warehouse. There she is, he said warmly, setting down a cooking utensil to embrace me. The financial world's newest power player. I laughed, relaxing into his welcome. Hardly, though the board did approve the strategic plan without reservation. Of course they did, he replied, returning to his culinary creation. It's impossible to find flaws in your analysis, and your vision for the firm bridges traditional finance with emerging values in a way that's both progressive and pragmatic. His understanding of my work, despite operating in the entirely different world of art and creative expression, was one of the qualities I most valued in our relationship. James had never felt threatened by my professional success or intellectual capacity. He genuinely celebrated my accomplishments while pursuing his own with equal passion. Grace Martinez stopped by the office, I mentioned as I accepted the glass of wine he offered. Apparently, Nathan has moved to Chicago for a senior agency position. James paused briefly, giving me a thoughtful look. How do you feel about that? The question was characteristic of his emotional intelligence, not assuming my reaction, but creating space for it to be expressed. Neutral, mostly, I replied honestly. Though I did find myself hoping he's learned enough from past experiences to build something sustainable this time. James nodded, understanding the complexity beneath the simple response. Closure isn't about wishing someone ill. It's about their choices no longer having the power to affect your emotional well-being. Exactly, I agreed, appreciating his perception. His move is simply information about someone I used to know, not a development that impacts my life in any meaningful way. We transitioned to discussing other topics as dinner progressed. His upcoming exhibition featuring emerging Northwest artists, my plans for the leadership team restructuring, our shared interest in potentially purchasing a small property on one of the San Juan Islands, where both his painting and my photography could find inspiration in the dramatic landscapes. Later, as we sat comfortably in the living area with the Seattle skyline visible through the large industrial windows, James broached a subject we had occasionally discussed but never fully resolved. I've been thinking about our living arrangement, he began, his tone thoughtful rather than pressuring. Not suggesting any dramatic change, but wondering if we might consider options that better accommodate our shared time while maintaining the independent spaces we both value. It was a reasonable consideration. We currently divided our time between two residences, each maintaining our separate homes while spending 3 or 4 nights a week together. The arrangement worked, but created practical complications with duplicated necessities and constant small migrations between locations. What specifically did you have in mind? I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Perhaps a shared property that includes studio space for my painting and your photography, alongside living quarters that allow for both togetherness and personal retreat, he suggested. Not necessarily replacing our current places immediately, but creating a third option that better reflects how our relationship has evolved. The proposal was characteristic of James, thoughtful, respectful of boundaries, and focused on practical enhancements rather than conventional relationship escalation. He wasn't suggesting marriage or complete domestic merger, but a creative solution that honored both our connection and our individual needs. I like the concept, I acknowledged after considering it, though the execution would require careful thought, location, design, financial structure, all considerations that would shape how effectively it would serve its purpose. He smiled, recognizing my analytical approach even to personal matters. Of course, I'm not suggesting an immediate decision, just opening the conversation about possibilities that might enhance what we've built together while respecting what we've each built independently. This was the fundamental difference between my relationship with James and my marriage to Nathan. With Nathan, accommodations and compromises had been expected rather than discussed, each small surrender of independence occurring without explicit negotiation until the cumulative effect became a significant imbalance. With James, every evolution was consciously considered, openly communicated, and mutually designed to enhance rather than diminish each partner's autonomy. It's worth exploring, I agreed. Perhaps we could begin researching properties that might accommodate the concept while developing clearer parameters for what we each envision. He nodded, satisfied with this measured response. Neither of us felt compelled to force immediate resolution or commitment, another quality of our relationship that I particularly valued. Time was an ally rather than a pressure point, allowing organic development without artificial urgency. As the evening continued, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had led to this moment. The financial betrayal that had initiated my divorce from Nathan had been painful, but ultimately transformative, creating the conditions for growth that might otherwise have remained dormant. The offshore savings that had protected my assets had become the foundation for expanded independence and opportunity, both professionally and personally. The following morning brought a series of leadership meetings at Jackson & Pierce, where I introduced my senior team to specific aspects of the strategic plan approved by the board. These were the people who would implement the vision. Experienced professionals I had selected for both technical expertise and alignment with the firm's evolving culture. The Asia-Pacific initiative will require substantial coordination between our investment and client relations teams, I explained, highlighting the relevant organizational structure on the presentation screen. Rachel will lead this integration, with support from both departments to ensure seamless implementation. Rachel Chen, my recently appointed Chief Operating Officer, nodded in acknowledgement. Her promotion had been one of my first executive decisions, recognizing talent that had been overlooked by previous leadership despite her exceptional performance and innovative approaches. Our working relationship had quickly developed into a powerful partnership, with Rachel's operational expertise complementing my strategic vision. We've already initiated preliminary market analysis, Rachel noted, referring to her tablet. Initial findings suggest our sustainable investment framework will have particular resonance with emerging client segments in Singapore and Sydney. The meeting proceeded efficiently, each team member contributing insights while demonstrating clear understanding of both their individual responsibilities and the collective vision. This was leadership as I had come to practice it: collaborative, yet decisive, visionary yet practical, ambitious yet grounded in realistic assessment of resources and capabilities. As the session concluded, I felt a moment of quiet pride in what we were building together. Jackson & Pierce was evolving into an organization that reflected my values and vision while honoring its established reputation for excellence. The firm's growth was no longer defined solely by traditional metrics of assets under management, but by a more comprehensive view of impact and sustainability. Sophia arrived that afternoon, sweeping into my office with her characteristic energy and immediately noticing the subtle changes in the space since her last visit. "Corner office suits you," she observed, glancing around approvingly. "Though I see you've resisted the traditional executive trappings in favor of your own aesthetic." She was right. Rather than the expected dark wood and leather typically associated with financial leadership, I had opted for clean lines, natural materials, and strategic placement of my own photography alongside works from Northwest artists featured in James's gallery. The space reflected my personal taste while maintaining appropriate professional presence. Another example of integration rather than compartmentalization in my life. "Congratulations, Managing Director," Sophia said, embracing me warmly. "Though, I'm still waiting for you to join me in Singapore permanently. The financial sector there could use your particular brand of strategic innovation. Perhaps I'll consider it when you finally commit to one location for longer than 6 months," I countered with a smile. Sophia's global role kept her perpetually in motion between financial centers across Asia and the Pacific, a lifestyle she thrived in despite its inherent challenges. "Fair point," she acknowledged. "Though I'm beginning to consider a more anchored approach, possibly Hong Kong as a primary base with regular circuits to subsidiary markets." This was new. Sophia had always embraced constant movement, seeing it as liberation rather than disruption. "What's prompted the reconsideration?" I asked, genuinely curious. A slight smile crossed her face. "Perhaps I'm finally understanding what you've discovered with James, that stability and freedom aren't necessarily opposing forces when properly balanced." Our conversation continued as we left the office for an early dinner before the weekend's planned celebrations. Sophia updated me on mutual acquaintances, market developments in her region, and her own evolving perspective on work-life integration. I shared details of my new role, James's exhibition success, and our preliminary thoughts about a shared property. As we settled at our table in one of Seattle's premier waterfront restaurants, Sophia raised her glass in a toast. "To Offshore, accounts and unexpected journeys," she said with knowing humor. I smiled, recognizing the reference to where this all began. To financial independence and emotional growth, I countered, clinking my glass against hers. The sunset painted Elliott Bay in shades of amber and rose as we continued our dinner, the Olympic Mountains silhouetted against the deepening sky. This view had once been the backdrop for business meetings where I carefully maintained professional composure while Nathan charmed clients with practiced ease. Now it was simply a beautiful setting for connecting with a treasured friend. No performance required, no secondary agenda to maintain. Later that evening, as Sophia, James, and I continued our celebration at my townhouse, my phone buzzed with an email notification. I glanced at it briefly, noticing the sender, Nathan Collins. After a moment's consideration, I excused myself briefly to read the unexpected communication. Rebecca, I hope this message finds you well. I realize we haven't spoken in years and I have no expectation of response. I simply wanted to congratulate you on your appointment as managing director at Jackson & Pierce. The news reached Chicago financial circles this week, and I felt compelled to acknowledge this significant achievement. Your success doesn't surprise me, though I admit the speed and extent of your professional ascent is remarkable even knowing your capabilities. What you've accomplished these past few years stands as testament to talents I recognized but never fully appreciated during our marriage. I've reflected often on our conversation years ago about the invisible support system I failed to acknowledge. That understanding has shaped my approach to my current role and relationships in ways I hope represent growth, however belated. My life has taken its own path, professionally satisfying though personally still evolving. I'm engaged to be married next spring to someone very different from both you and Olivia, a pediatric surgeon with a pragmatic worldview and little patience for self-delusion. She reminds me of you in her clarity, though with a very different, professional focus. I don't share this seeking any particular response or reconnection. Our chapters together concluded appropriately, and we've each written new narratives since then. I simply wanted to acknowledge your achievement and express genuine admiration for how you've transformed challenge into opportunity. Be well, Nathan. I read the message twice, somewhat surprised by both its existence and its content. The tone was neither manipulative nor overly familiar, just a straightforward acknowledgement from someone who had once known me intimately and was now observing my public success from a significant distance. After brief consideration, I composed a simple reply. Nathan, thank you for the kind words. I appreciate the acknowledgement and am pleased to hear you've found a fulfilling professional path and personal relationship. Growth often emerges from our most challenging transitions when we remain open to their lessons. I wish you continued success and happiness in Chicago. Best regards, Rebecca. The exchange felt appropriate, cordial without false intimacy, acknowledging shared history without reopening closed chapters. Nathan's growth was his own journey, just as mine had been, and our paths had diverged permanently, but without lingering animosity. I returned to the living room where Sophia and James were engaged in animated conversation about the intersection of financial markets and artistic trends, a topic that perfectly captured the complementary worldviews that enriched my life. Neither asked about my brief absence, respecting the natural ebb and flow of attention in comfortable company. As the evening continued, I found myself struck by a moment of clarity about the journey of the past 4 years. What had begun as a defensive financial maneuver, establishing offshore savings to protect against potential betrayal, had ultimately initiated a profound transformation that transcended monetary concerns. The revelation that had forced Nathan to confront the reality of his dependence on my support had simultaneously liberated me to discover the full extent of my capabilities when directed toward my own aspirations rather than someone else's advancement. The financial independence I had secured through strategic planning had created the foundation for emotional, professional, and creative independence that now defined my life. Tomorrow would bring a sailing expedition around the San Juan Islands, with Sophia and James, A perfect blend of the relationships and experiences that now form the center of my life. Next week would begin implementation of the strategic vision I had developed for Jackson & Pierce, shaping the firm's future while enhancing my own leadership legacy. The months ahead would include exploration of the shared property concept with James, continuing evolution of my photography portfolio, and expansion of both personal and professional horizons. Each of these elements represented a life consciously crafted rather than passively accepted. A life that had emerged from crisis, but was now defined by choice rather than reaction. The offshore accounts that had once represented necessary protection now symbolized something far more significant: the foundation of authentic independence and the courage to define success on my own terms. As I looked around at the warm gathering in my home, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for what I had lost, but for what I had found in its aftermath. The path forward was clear, illuminated not by external validation or reflection in someone else's eyes, but by the steady light of self-knowledge and purposeful direction. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them. Out!